Evening, whichever the case may be, this intermediate time. I'm Hobson Wildenthal, the Provost of the University of Texas at Dallas. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our campus and to this second Einspruch lecture on the Holocaust. The name Einspruch lecture is so new that it's not printed on our program because it was only 2 weeks ago that we were able to formally endow the lecture series, and we'd already been so foresightful as to print up our program not knowing we were going to have that done by now. But as you know, last year's lecture was postponed till recently, and it's then with great pleasure that we follow right on with another distinguished notable giving this year's lecture. The Einspruch lectures are only one component of our Holocaust Studies program at the university. The program incorporates scholarship, original research by faculty and students on the Holocaust. It involves a curriculum through which many dozen of our students have progressed and gone on to teach younger children and other college students what they learned here at UTD in our program. And it incorporates the lecture series and has for now more than 10 years as an avenue by which our students and our faculty can share discussions and ideas with the world's leading scholars and authorities, and also simultaneously as a mechanism by which we can bring our friends in the community together with our faculty and students and stake out with our community members a broader community of scholars and citizens. So the program, as you see it tonight, as the lecture, is actually much broader and deeper, but this is the focus by which we do connect with people outside the university. As well as, of course, tomorrow we'll have another lecture which is devoted more to our students and the faculty, more on the techniques and technology and scholarship of how one does the research. It's now my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to the director of our Holocaust Studies program, my friend and colleague, Professor Zsuzsanna Oshvath. Zsuzsanna.
Thank you, Hobson, and thank you to everybody who has been helping us to make this possible. Thank you to Dr. Einspruch, and thank you to everybody else who was active and who has done everything that they could. I am enormously grateful to the university, to Dean Kratz, to Debbie Pfister, who has made this lecture really possible. It was her incredible input and her incredible love and concern for that program that made it possible that we have the best food each time we come together, that everything goes out in time, that she receives all the telephone calls, and that she has my constant nagging and call, which must not be that pleasant, but she's doing it anyway, and I thank her so deeply and so much. I would like to introduce Professor Jan T. Gross, the author of the book Neighbors, The Destruction of the Jewish Community in Jedwabne, Poland. We all have written books and articles and have published a whole lot, and always so deeply hope that many people read what we have written and that many people care about exactly this research we have undertaken. There are only very few of us who are so lucky that they can achieve that what Professor Gross has, namely that his book has made a major impact, not only in America and all over the Western world, but in Poland, the very country about which this book was written a year and a half ago. In a way, it is very important to know, if we care a little bit about the Holocaust's reception in the various countries where it has taken place. And the Polish situation is a very special one. I would never even touch it. Here he is who will speak about it. But it is very important to know that a whole country has looked upon this event as an event that took place, a murder that took place, a destruction that took place, that was carried out by the Germans. As always, most of the time it happens that most countries, but perhaps more so in Poland than anywhere else, countries like to look upon these horrific events as the deeds of the Germans. In a way, Professor Gross's book has made a major impact on the cultural, educational, intellectual life in Poland. It has been subject of constant discussions for over a year by now. And it is no wonder also in the American historic community interested in the Holocaust and in the Polish version of it, that he has been enormously highly appreciated. And as we learned lately, he has become the finalist of the National Book Foundation Prize, which will be announced on November 14th. And whether or not he wins this prize or not, we are going to think of him and believe, after having read this book, that he certainly has deserved to be the winner of that award. Thank you very much, Professor Gross.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for the invitation to this evening's lecture. I'm deeply honored by your trust in me. I'm sorry, there's some kind of a sound. I have here another microphone. Maybe that's one microphone too many. Yeah, probably. And this is truly a wonderful experience for me so far. And I trust it will continue tomorrow. My first visit to Dallas, and I already feel at home. So this is a great achievement, I think, of all of you who have been very gracious hosts. You cannot hear it, yes? Okay. Let me do this then. We'll see. Now it's better, yes? Very good. Okay. Before I proceed with a description and my lecture on Jedwabne, I would like to perhaps briefly speak about the context in which this episode takes place. Of course, you are an audience that is very well versed in the history of this period, and I assume that it is so. Nevertheless, there are certain peculiarities of Jedwabne and the sequence of events that take place there, which one should keep in mind. The first thing which I want to say is that the German occupation of Poland and countries further east, but we're talking now about Poland, has been incredibly brutal to everybody, not just, of course, the Jews have suffered the ultimate tragedy, but the Slavic population there, whether these were Poles or Ukrainians or Belarusians or Russians, was subjected by the Nazis to an incredibly brutal regime of occupation with very, very high losses and a lot of suffering. So the memory of the war in Poland and the experience of the war is one of immense suffering, as I say, of the entire population. Everybody has some family experiences which ultimately have led to death of dear ones, more or less. Poland also is fairly unique during the Second World War on account of having been subjected to two occupations, particularly during first 2 years of the war, between 1939, the outbreak of the war in September, and June of 1941, when Russo-German war begins. It is a country that has been partitioned, really, in September of 1939, and half of it, actually a little bit more than half even, as far as territory is concerned, has been occupied by the Soviet Union, which, and this is a fact that has been conveniently relegated to oblivion also in historiography for the first 2 years of the war, was a tacit de facto ally of Nazi Germany, a kind of a friendly neutral country. Jedwabne, this is very important as far as the fate of Jews in these territories was concerned. Really the kind of a hecatomb, the massive killings of the Jewish population by the Nazis begin in the summer of 1941, after the beginning of the campaign against the Soviet Union, which starts on June 22nd, and takes place in the territories initially that have been Polish before the war, then under the Soviet occupation from September of 1939 to June of 1941, and then the Nazis move in. Jedwabne is one of these, is a town in that suffers this fate. It is important to keep in mind that during the period of Soviet occupation, the population that lived there in these territories was subject to a very ferocious regime of Sovietization, of deportations, of arbitrary arrests. This is Stalin at the height of his madness, so to speak. An awful lot of people and an awful lot of violence was meted out at the time. And there is also, and that's something that needs to be kept in mind, in the experience of local population, different groups have been treated somewhat differently by the Soviets. And in the minds of local Poles, Jews under the Soviet occupation were a favored community. They were treated better than others, and they were, in the opinion of this Polish or Ukrainian or Belarusian population, and they also collaborated with the Soviets. I'm not going to go into the more general discussion of this phenomenon. This is, as facts go, it is not true that Jews have received favored treatment in any way. The Jews have been arrested, deported, and terrorized, and subject to Sovietization, just as any other category of people there. If anything, if you look at facts, we can come to it later, even perhaps more affected than others for some specific reasons. But nevertheless, such a perception existed. I want you to keep this in mind. I will come back to it at a certain moment. Let me finally say that what you will see and hear rather as I go along might be quite a sort of array of proper names and statements which are attributed to various people. This is a story which has been put together on the basis of personal testimonies, to some extent of Jewish survivors who have been there and managed to live through the war and left a testimony about what has happened to them, but primarily on the basis of statements made by a group of people who were among the perpetrators and who have been put on trial in Poland in 1949, immediately after the war, under the accusation of having been collaborators of the Germans and participated in that murder. On January 8, 1949, in the small town of Jedwabne, some 19 kilometers from Łomża, in Poland's historical province of Mazowsze, security police detained 15 men. Among the arrested, mostly small farmers and seasonal workers, there were 2 shoemakers, a mason, a carpenter, 2 locksmiths, a letter carrier, and the former town hall receptionist. Some were family men, one a father of 6 children, another of 4, some still unattached. The youngest was 27 years old, the oldest was 64. They were, to put it in a nutshell, a bunch of ordinary men. Jedwabne's inhabitants, at the time totaling about 2,000, must have been shocked by the simultaneous arrest of so many local residents. The wider public got a glimpse of the whole affair 4 months later, when on May 16 and 17, in the district court of Łomża, a trial was held against Bolesław Ramotowski and 21 co-defendants. The opening sentence of the indictment reads, and I quote, "Jewish Historical Institute in Poland sent materials to the Ministry of Justice describing criminal activities of the inhabitants of Jedwabne who engaged in the murder of Jewish people, as stated in the testimony of Szmul Wasserstein, who witnessed the pogrom of the Jews." Unquote. Wasserstein gave his testimony before the Jewish Historical Commission in Białystok on April 5th, 1945. And this is what he said. I'm quoting from Wasserstein. Till the war broke out, 1,600 Jews lived in Jedwabne, and only 7 survived, saved by a Polish woman, Wyrzykowska, who lived in the vicinity. On Monday evening, June 23, 1941, Germans entered the town. And already on the 25th, local bandits from the Polish population started an anti-Jewish pogrom. 2 of those bandits, Borowski, Wacek, and his brother Mietek, walked from one Jewish dwelling to another, together with other bandits, playing accordion and flute to drown the screams of Jewish women and children. I saw with my own eyes how those murderers killed Hajcia Wasserstein, Jakub Katz, 73 years old, and Eliasz Krawiecki. Jakub Katz they stoned to death with bricks. Krawiecki they knifed and then plucked his eyes and cut off his tongue. On the same day, I observed a horrible scene. Haja Kubrzańska, 28 years old, and Basia Binstein, 26 years old, both holding newborn babies. When they saw what is going on, they ran to a pond in order to drown themselves with the children rather than fall into the hands of bandits. They put their children in the water and drowned them with their own hands. Then Baśka Binstein jumped in, and she immediately went to the bottom, while Haja Kubrzańska suffered for a couple of hours. Assembled hooligans made a spectacle of this. They advised her to lie face down in the water so that she drowns faster. Finally, seeing that the children are already dead, she threw herself more energetically into the water and found her death too. The next day, a local priest intervened, explaining that they should stop the pogrom, that the German authorities will take care of things by themselves. This worked, and the pogrom was stopped. In the meantime, rumor spread that the Germans will issue an order to destroy all the Jews. Such an order was issued by the Germans on July 10th, 1941. Even though the Germans gave the order, it was Polish hooligans who took it up and carried it out using the most horrible methods. After various tortures and humiliations, they burned all the Jews in a barn. During the first pogrom and later bloodbath, the following outcasts distinguished themselves by their brutality: Szlesiński, Karolak, Borowiuk, Mietek, Ramutowski, Bolek, Szelawa, Stanisław, Kozłowski, Gienek, Tarnoczek, Jerzyk, Laudański, Jurek. On the morning of July 10th, 1941, 8 Gestapo men came to town and had a meeting with representatives of the town authorities. When the Gestapo asked what their plans are with respect to the Jews, they said unanimously that all Jews must be killed. When the Germans proposed to leave one Jewish family from each profession, local carpenter Bronisław Ślesiński, who was present, answered, "We have enough of our own craftsmen. We have to destroy all the Jews. None should stay alive." Mayor Karolak and everybody else agreed with his words. For this purpose, Ślesiński gave his own barn, which stood nearby. After this meeting, the bloodbath began. Local hooligans armed themselves with axes, special clubs studded with nails, and other instruments of torture and destruction, and chased all the Jews into the street. As the first victims of their devilish instincts, they selected 75 of the youngest and healthiest Jews, whom they ordered to pick up a huge monument of Lenin, which the Russians had erected in the center of town. It was impossibly heavy, but under a rain of horrible blows, the Jews had to do it. While carrying the monument, they also had to sing until they brought it to the designated place. There, they were ordered to dig a hole and throw the monument in. Then the same Jews were butchered to death and thrown into the same hole. Beards of all Jews were burned, newborn babies were killed at their mothers' breasts, people were beaten murderously and forced to sing and dance. In the end, they proceeded to the main action, the burning. The entire town was surrounded by guards so that nobody could escape. Then Jews were ordered to line up in a column, 4 in a row, and the 90-year-old rabbi and the shochet were put in front. They were given a red banner, and all were ordered to sing and were chased into the bar. Hooligans bestially beat them up on the way. Near the gate, a few hooligans were standing playing various instruments in order to drown the screams of horrified victims. Some tried to defend themselves, but they were defenseless. Bloodied and wounded, they were pushed into the barn. Then the barn was doused with kerosene and lit. While it is clear to a reader of Wasserstein's deposition that Jews were annihilated in Jedwabne with particular cruelty, it is difficult at first to fully absorb the meaning of this testimony. And in a way, I am not at all surprised that 4 years had elapsed between the time when he made his statement and the beginning of the Łomża trial. This is more or less how much time elapsed since I found Wasserstein's testimony in Jewish Institute's archives and before I understood what he's really telling us. In any case, once we realize that what seems inconceivable is precisely what actually happened, a historian soon discovers that the whole story is very well documented, that witnesses are still alive, and that the memory of this crime has been preserved in Jedwabne through the generation. As I mentioned to you earlier, the basis of this study are really testimonies of people who have been queried about this, whether as part of the investigation of their crime or leaving the positions in the Jewish Historical Institute more or less at the time when it happened. Let me say about Jedwabne before the war that it was more or less a little town like any other town in this area. And if one looks and reads the memorial book of Jedwabne Jews, which was published in 1980, if one speaks to Jews who are Jedwabne residents, who are still alive, something which I was privileged to do, they remember the relationships between Jedwabne Poles and Jedwabne Jews as just sort of benign and relatively friendly coexistence. It's quite characteristic for those of you who know Polish that when you read the testimony, for example, of Wasserstein, in which he points out and names those who have been among the most brutal perpetrators, he uses nicknames, or if you will, he doesn't use full names, but diminutives, very familiar form of first names of these people. Instead of Jerzy, he would say Jurek. Instead of Stanisław, he would say Stasiek. People were on first name basis, and they communicated with one another. I mentioned to you that the period of Soviet occupation was also one in which nothing really, my first concern was, since such an unusual and dramatic episode has happened there in July of 1941, to look for some unusual and dramatic and therefore informative as to the possible causes of what has happened episode during the Soviet occupation, for instance, or before the war. Before the war, I couldn't find anything. This is, as I say, a town like any other. During the Soviet occupation, again, there is no much evidence of anything except for one issue that emerges as a very important one there. In one respect, the Gmina Jedwabne had a history unlike most places under the Soviet occupation. A vast anti-Soviet underground organization was established there early on, and in June of 1940, several months into the Soviet occupation, it was tracked down by the Soviet secret police, NKVD, and destroyed. First, its headquarters in the Kobielno forest nearby were overwhelmed by an assault of NKVD troops, and a good number of people were killed on both sides. And then, since all the documents of the organization were dug out by the Soviets in Kobielno, numerous arrests were carried out throughout the area. Some 250 people from the vicinity of Jedwabne, Radziłów, and Wizna, these are two towns in the vicinity, were imprisoned on this occasion. Many more members of the organization who feared for their safety fled from homes and hid in the surrounding forests and swamps. Naturally, a historian investigating the trail of violence in the area would like to know whether any connection can be established between these two extraordinary events, the destruction of the Polish underground organization in June 1940 by the Soviets, and the mass murder of the Jews in July 1941 by the Poles. By sheer coincidence, two important testimonies preserved from the period shed interesting light on the story. Corporal Antoni Borawski from the hamlet of Witynie, situated some 4 kilometers from Jedwabne, left with the historical bureau of the Anders Army, an army that has been created during the war from people who have been deported into the Soviet Union and who were former Polish citizens and then fought against the Germans. He left a long narrative curriculum vitae, which was called My Biography for 1940-1941. He had been arrested on July 4th, about 2 weeks after the shootout in the forest between NKVD troops and the Polish underground, and suffered a long and painful interrogation. But he survived the incarceration and in the end was able to tell the tale of betrayal that allowed the Soviet secret police to destroy the underground. Borawski identifies in his testimony some half a dozen traitors, including one he met face-to-face in prison during a confrontation staged by his captors. And none of them is a Jew. The manager of the cooperative where Borawski was employed, a certain Lewinowicz, was present at the time of Borawski's arrest in Jedwabne. And this is the only Jewish name and the only reported involvement of a Jew in the whole affair. There has been some further research done on it by Polish historians. And again, there is no trace really of Jewish involvement in the denunciation and the process of destruction of this organization. But we have yet another very interesting document at our disposal that bears on the matter. Early in 1941, some 6 months after the debacle of destruction of this organization, the chief of the Białystok district NKVD, Białystok is the main town in the area, Colonel Misiurew, wrote a memo to the secretary of the district Białystok Committee of the Communist Party of the Bolsheviks of Białorussia, a certain Popov. We're still in the period when Soviet occupation was there. In this report, Misiurew summarized and evaluated activities of the Polish underground in the Jedwabne region and offered an appraisal of anti-insurgent methods deployed by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. And he writes in this memo, among other details, that some time after the headquarters of this organization were destroyed, an amnesty was proclaimed for all members of the underground organization on condition that they identify themselves and come out of hiding. until December 25, states Mishurev, the NKVD colonel, 106 people availed themselves of this opportunity, this amnesty. And then he continues, and I quote from him, "From this group, we recruited 25 people who are now carrying on further intelligence work," unquote. This is an interesting piece of information in itself, but we should keep it in mind also because it will come back to us in due course from an altogether different source. In any case, the Jews from Jedwabne were not implicated in this whole affair. The NKVD, as you see, was able to recruit some of the former members of this organization to spy for them later on. Before we proceed to the description of what has happened in Jedwabne on July 10th, which I will do in 1 second, I just want simply to say that even though I consider Jedwabne as a very unique and unusual episode, I mean it with a small caveat. In fact, the murder in Jedwabne it comes at the end of a triple murder, which takes place in a rapid sequence. On July 5th, a very similar episode takes place in the little town of Wąsosz. On July 7th, an episode like this takes place in the town of Radziłów. And then on July 10th, the Jedwabne murder takes place. These are all towns that are very close to one another. The population living in those towns has been, the Jewish population in any case, has been related by kinship, and the Jews were also fleeing from these towns. When some horror would be taking place in one town, they would just run away to another town. Jedwabne at the time had quite a lot of Jews who have escaped from these towns in the vicinity because of the murders that were taking place there. The murder of Jedwabne Jews on July 10th, 1941 was coordinated by the town's mayor, Marian Karolak. His name appears in virtually every deposition. He is certainly the evil spirit of this tragedy. A few other people identified in leading roles that they were also employed in the town council. A road watchman, Mieczysław Gerwat, put it simply, and I quote, "The entire town council participated in this murder of Jews," unquote. Where the initiative came from, whether it originated from the Germans, as per Wasserstein's phrase, "such an order was issued by the Germans," or with the town council members of Jedwabne, is impossible to settle once and for all. But it is also a moot question, since both sides apparently quickly agreed on the matter and the method of its implementation. That the town council signed some agreement with the Gestapo, as people describe it, we are told by several witnesses who had not been present on the occasion, however, but repeat what they have heard from various people. In all likelihood, the municipal authorities were given a certain amount of time, 8 hours, if we are to take literally an angry reprimand by the gendarmerie commander, which I am about to quote, to do with the Jews as they please. What we would like to know, however, with as much precision as possible, is what specific role did the Germans play in the implementation of this murder, how many of them were in town on that day, and what did they do? There was an outpost of German gendarmerie in Jedwabne, staffed by 11 men. In the sources at our disposal, gendarmes, or actually far more frequently a gendarme, appear as part of an explanation describing the circumstances which led several of the accused to show up in the market square or near the bar. Thus, in a rather typical deposition, Czesław Lipiński, one of the accused, tells the court how Jurek Laudański, Eugeniusz Kalinowski, quote, and one German, unquote, came to fetch him, and how he went with them to round up Jews to the square. Felix Tarnacki was visited by Karolak and Wasilewski, who, and I quote again, together with a Gestapo man, chased me to the square, unquote, and told him, Wasilewski, to guard the Jews. Now, let us understand the broader context in which the murder took place. At the time, the overall undisputed bosses over life and death in Jedwabne were the Germans. No sustained organized activity could take place there without their consent. They were the only ones who could decide the fate of the Jews. It was within their power also to stop the murderous pogrom at any time, and they did not choose to intervene. Even if they had suggested to spare some Jewish families, they must have done so without serious conviction, for all the Jews on whom the murderers laid their hands were killed in the end. And ironically, on that day, the outpost of the German gendarmerie was the safest place in town for the Jews, and a few survived only because they happened to be there at the time. But it is also clear that had Jedwabne not been occupied by Germans, the Jews of Jedwabne would not have been murdered by their neighbors. This is not a gratuitous observation. The tragedy of Jedwabne Jewry is but an episode in the murderous war that Hitler waged against all Jews. As to direct participation of the Germans in the mass murder of Jews in Jedwabne on July 10, 1941, however, one must admit that it was limited pretty much to taking pictures. Who murdered the Jews of Jedwabne? Edward Śleszyński, I quote him. In the barn of my father, Bronisław Śleszyński, a lot of Jews were burned. I didn't see it with my own eyes since I was in the bakery on that day, but I know from people who lived in Jedwabne at the time that Poles carried out this deed. Germans participated only in photographing, unquote. Bolesław Ramotowski was the principal accused in the trial in Łomża. I want to stress that Germans did not participate in the murder of Jews. They just stood and took pictures of how Poles mistreated the Jews, unquote. Julia Sokołowska worked at the time as a cook for the gendarmes. When she was questioned during the investigation of the case against Ramotowski on January 11, 1949, she made the following deposition. A few days after the German occupying army entered Polish territory in 1941, inhabitants of Jedwabne, together with the Germans, started to kill Jews living in the town of Jedwabne, where they killed over 1,500 people of Jewish nationality. I stress that I did not see any Germans beating the Jews. The Germans even brought 3 Jewish women to the gendarmerie outpost and said to make sure that they don't get killed. So I locked them up and gave the key to the gendarme, who told me to lock them up, and he ordered me to give them something to eat. So I prepared something and I brought it to them. When everything was over and things calmed down, these Jewish women were let go, and they lived in a house near the gendarmerie, and they came to work at the gendarmerie outpost. Germans did not beat the Jews. The Polish population bestially massacred the Jews, and Germans stood only to the side and took pictures, and later they showed how Poles killed the Jews, unquote. Sokołowska then proceeds to enumerate 15 names of individuals or entire families, fathers with sons, for instance, or brothers, who took an active part in the massacre. Sources at our disposal allow, by my count, to identify 92 names, and often their home addresses to boot, of people who participated in the murder of Jedwabne Jews. Perhaps not all of them should be labeled murderers. After all, 9 of the accused in the Łomża trials were found not guilty. Various people who guarded the Jews in the square may have perhaps just been there uninvolved in acts of brutality. On the other hand, we also know that people mentioned by name are only a fraction of those who were there at the time. Near the assembled Jews, states Władysław Miciura, another defendant in the Łomża trial, there was a mass of people not only from Jedwabne but also from the surroundings. The crowd of perpetrators swelled somehow as Jews were being herded towards the barn when they were incinerated at the end. As Bolesław Ramotowski put it, and I quote him, "When we were chasing them to the barn, I couldn't see because it was very crowded." There were many peasants from hamlets whom I didn't know, explains Miciura. These were, for the most part, young men who enjoyed this cutting of the Jews, and they tortured them, unquote. In other words, it was a mass murder in a double sense, on account of the number of victims as well as the number of perpetrators. 92 participants in the murder were singled out by name. These were all adult men, residents of the town of Jedwabne. What does this number signify? Before the war, some 2,500 people lived in the town, with Jews making up about 2/3 of this total. If we divide the ethnically Polish population in half, we get about 450 male Polish residents, including children and elderly. To get the number of grown-ups, let us divide this figure in half again, and we will have to conclude that roughly half of the adult men from Jedwabne are identified by name among participants of the pogrom. It all began with a convocation on the morning of July 10th of all adult Polish males to Jedwabne's town hall. More or less at the same time, when Poles had been called to the town hall, Jews were ordered to assemble at the square for allegedly some cleaning duty. Rivka Fogel recalled that she meant to bring along a broom. Since earlier Jews had been pressed into debasing cleanup jobs, one could imagine at first that it was but a routine exercise in humiliation. My husband took our 2 children, and when there, I stayed at home for a while, trying to put things in order and lock the doors and windows properly, unquote. But it became clear almost instantly that the circumstances were somehow different on that day. Mrs. Fogel did not follow her husband and children to the square. Instead, together with a neighbor, Mrs. Pravde, she hid in the nearby garden on a nobleman's estate. And a few moments later, and I quote her, we could hear from there the terrible cries of a young boy, Joseph Levin, whom the Goyim were beating to death, unquote. By some uncanny coincidence, we learn from the testimony of Karol Bardoń, who happened to be passing by in the vicinity a few moments later. Karol Bardoń is one of the accused in the Łomża trial, the only person who gets sentenced to death, actually, that Levin had been stoned to death. Bardoń was repairing a car in the courtyard of the German gendarmerie outpost and had to go this morning to the tool shed on the nobleman's estate, in whose garden the 2 women, as we know, were hiding. I quote Bardoń now. Around the corner from the foundry adjacent to the tool shed, an inhabitant of Jedwabne, Wiśniewski, was standing. Wiśniewski called me, and I came closer, and Wiśniewski pointed to a massacred cadaver of a young man whose name was Levin, and said to me, "Look, mister, we killed this son of the bitch with stones." Wiśniewski showed me a stone weighing 12 to 14 kilograms and said, "I smacked him good with this stone, and he won't get up anymore," unquote. This took place at the very beginning of the pogrom. As Bardoń writes, on his way to the tool shed, he saw a group of only about 100 Jews on the square, which by the time he was on his way back had grown considerably. In another part of town, Wincenty Gościcki had just returned home from a night watchman's duty. In the morning, when I went to bed, my wife came and told me to get up and said that bad things are going on. Near our house, people were beating Jews with clubs. I got up then and went outside the house. Then I was called by Urbanowski, who told me, "Look what is going on," and showed me 4 Jewish corpses. These were Fishman, the 2 Styakowskis, and Bluebird. I hid in the house, unquote. From early on that day, the Jews understood that they were in mortal danger. Many tried to escape into neighboring fields, but only a few succeeded. It was difficult to get out of town without being noticed, as small vigilante groups of peasants were milling around trying to ferret out and catch hiding and fleeing Jews. Some 100 to 200 people perhaps managed to run away, hide, and survive that day, but many others were killed on the spot, right where they were apprehended. On this day, a cacophony of violence swept through the town. It unfolded as many uncoordinated, simultaneous initiatives over which Karolak, the mayor, and the town council exercised only general supervision. Bardoń was on his way to the tool shed one more time later in the day, and he stumbled on Wiśniewski in the same place as before, near Levin's body. I understood that Wiśniewski is waiting here for something. I took all the necessary parts from the tool shed, and on my way back, I met the same 2 young men whom I saw when I went to the tool shed for the first time this morning. He will later tell us that these were Jerzy Laudański and a certain Kalinowski. I understood that they were coming to Wiśniewski, to the place where Levin had been killed, and they were bringing another man of Mosaic persuasion, a married owner of the mechanical mill where I was employed till March 1939, called Herz Zdrojewicz. They held him under the arms, and blood was flowing from his head over his neck and onto his torso. Zdrojewicz said to me, "Save me, Mr. Bardon." Being afraid of these murderers, I replied, "I cannot help you with anything," and I passed them by. Unquote. And thus, in one part of town, Laudański with Wiśniewski and Kalinowski were stoning to death Levin and Zdrojewicz. In front of Gościcki's house, 4 Jews were clubbed to death by somebody else. In the pond near Łomżeńska Street, a certain Łuba Władysław drowned 2 Jewish blacksmiths. In still another location, Czesław Mierzejewski raped and then killed Judes Ibram. The beautiful Gitele Nadolny, the younger daughter of a Melamed, had her head cut off, and the murderers, we are told, later kicked it around. Throughout, Jews were mercilessly beaten, and their houses, in the meantime, were plundered. Simultaneously with multiple individual actions, more organized forms of persecution were also engulfing Jewish victims. Quote, "They took healthier men and chased them to the cemetery and ordered them to dig a pit, and after it was dug out, Jews were killed, every which way, one with iron, another with a knife, still another with a club." Unquote. The murderers got excited and were working at a frantic pace. "I stood on Przytulska Street," said an older woman, Bronisława Kalinowska, "and Jerzy Laudański, inhabitant of Jedwabne, was running down the street, and he said that he had already killed 2 or 3 Jews. He was very nervous and ran along." Unquote. But it must have soon become apparent that 1,500 people cannot be killed by such primitive methods in a day. So it was decided to kill all the Jews at once by burning them all together. This very same method had been used a few days earlier during the Radziłów pogrom. Before the Jews were chased along on their last brief journey from the square to the barn where they would all perish, Sobuta and his colleagues organized a sideshow. During the Soviet occupation, a statue of Lenin was erected in town right next to the main square. So, and I quote, "A group of Jews was brought to the little square to fell down Lenin's statue. When Jews broke the statue, they were told to put its various pieces on some boards and carry it around, and the rabbi was told to walk in front with his hat on a stick, and all had to sing, 'The war is because of us, the war is for us.' While carrying the statue, all the Jews were chased towards the barn, and the barn was doused with gasoline and lit, and in this manner 1,500 Jewish people perished." Unquote. I may add that during some excavations that have been done on the site, the statue of Lenin was unearthed last year. The worst murderers of the whole lot murder was probably a certain Kobrzyniecki. We are also told by a few witnesses that he was the one who lit the barn. Later, people said that the most Jews were killed by citizen Kobrzyniecki. I don't know his first name, recalls witness Edward Śleszyński. He apparently personally killed 18 Jews and participated the most in the burning of the barn. Housewife Aleksandra Karwowska knew from Kobrzyniecki himself that he, and I quote her, "knifed to death 18 Jews. He said this in my apartment when he was putting up the stove." Unquote. It was the middle of a very hot month of July, and the burned and asphyxiated corpses of murder victims had to be buried quickly. And there were no more Jews in town who could be ordered to accomplish this grisly task. Late in the evening, recalls Wincenty Gościcki, I was taken by the Germans to bury those burned corpses. But I could not do this because when I saw this, I started to vomit and I was released from burying the cadavers, unquote. Apparently, he was not the only one who couldn't stomach the job, since on the 2nd or 3rd day after the murder, we are told once again by Bardon, I was standing with Mayor Karolak in the square, not far from the outpost, and the commander of the outpost of the German gendarmerie in Jedwabne, Adamy, came up and said to the mayor with emphasis, "So, kill people and burn them, you managed, eh? But bury them, no one is eager to, eh? By morning, all must be buried, understood?" Unquote. After July 10th, a routine of the German occupation administration was re-established. A few survivors returned to town. They lingered there for a while. A few worked at the gendarmerie outpost. And in the end, they were driven by the Nazis to the ghetto in Łomża. A dozen people or so survived the war. 7 of the total had been hidden and cared for in the nearby Jamczewo hamlet by the Wyrzykowski family. Intimate biographies. In addition to protocols of interrogation of the witnesses and the accused, we find many other documents which were presented to the judicial authorities at different stages of the proceedings. And from these documents, we can count more details about the biographies of the perpetrators. A few days after the initial arrest in January of 1949, wives of the arrested men started sending petitions to the Łomża Security Office, laying out the special circumstances which they hoped would put the role of their husbands during the anti-Jewish pogrom in a better light. We can tease out from these texts interesting biographical details. Thus, Irena Janowska, the wife of Alexander, writes on January 28 that, and I quote her, "On the critical day, German gendarmerie walked around together with the mayor and the secretary Wasilewski and chased out males to go and guard Jews who were assembled in the square. They came to my house as well, where they found my husband and ordered him sternly, threatening with a gun to go to the square. My husband was afraid, did not know exactly what is going on, and feared for himself because under the first Soviets, 39-41, he worked as an inspector in a milk cooperative," unquote. 3 days later, Janina Żyluk writes a petition on behalf of her arrested husband. And I quote, "My husband, until the Soviet-German war broke out in 1941, worked as a supervisor in tax collection. For this reason, after the Germans came in 1941, he had to hide because everybody who worked for the Soviets was pursued and persecuted," unquote. We know that the state bureaucracy vastly expanded under the Soviet administration and that people had to make a living and therefore needed work. Also, it may have seemed logical to a wife of a man arrested by Stalinist security police after the war that his lot will improve when it became known that he once worked for a Soviet administration. So I would not attribute to these biographical items more than a curiosity value, but for the fact that there were more revelations of this sort in the files, and they kept getting more and more interesting. Take, for instance, this confessional text by Karol Bardoń, once again, the only man who received a death sentence in Ramotowski's case. And I quote him. "Following the Red Army's entrance into the Białystok voivodeship and after Soviet authorities were established in October of 1939, I returned to mending clocks. And occasionally, until April 20, 1940, I also carried out various commission jobs in my field of expertise for the NKVD, the secret police, and other offices of Soviet authorities. Here I was opening safes because keys were missing. I changed locks, made new keys, repaired typewriters, etc. From April 20, 1940, I became a supervisor as a mechanic and head of the major repairs shop at the mechanical tractor station. In this mechanical center, I was a brigade leader of the 1st Brigade and a technical controller. At the same time, I was a deputy to the city Soviet of the town of Jedwabne in Łomża County, elected official in other words. Bardoń was evidently a very good mechanic, but no professional qualifications would by themselves put him in all these positions under the Soviets. Clearly, he was also a trusted man. And there is finally the pièce de résistance, autobiographical revelation from one of the greatest evildoers on that day, the older Laudański brother, Zygmunt. Incidentally, he's alive till today. This is what he wrote in a petition addressed to the Ministry of Justice at the Security Police Office in Warsaw. He entitled it in such a way. From his jail in Ostrowiec on July 4th, 1949. This is his petition. When our territory was incorporated into the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, I was hiding at the time for about 6 months from the Soviet authorities. While I was hiding from deportation, I did not join bands of outlaws which were forming at the time on our territory, but I sent a plea to Generalissimus Stalin, which was forwarded by Moscow to the NKVD office in Jedwabne with an order to review. After observing my views, the NKVD in Jedwabne called me to join in work at liquidating anti-Soviet evil. In order to make my work more effective, my superiors ordered me, in order to avoid detection by reactionary elements, to take an anti-Soviet attitude since I was already known by the authorities. I feel wronged by the entire sentence because my views are different than suspected, because when I was in contact with the NKVD, my life was permanently in danger. And now, that was after the war, by joining the Polish Workers' Party, I felt how my well-being improved in the democratic spirit, and I believe, this is the quote, I find it truly phenomenal, that on shoulders like mine, our workers' regime may safely rest, unquote. We are struck at the first reading of this expose by the unbending conformism of this man. Apparently he tries to anticipate what each successive carnivorous regime of this epoch might most desire of its subjects, and goes to the end in his zeal to please. First by becoming a secret collaborator of the Soviet police and KVD, then by doing the Nazis' dirty work in killing the Jews, and finally by joining the Communist Party, the PPR, in independent Poland after the war. But these scraps of biographies of 4 individuals who turned out to be collaborators of Soviet authorities before they became German collaborators points to a more general phenomenon, I believe, than the mere individual trajectories of a few evil men. It is not just a question of character that plays itself out in this drama, but also the logic of incentives one encounters within the totalitarian regime of the 20th century. I shall comment on this issue in concluding remarks. The murder, I'm not sure if I will, because I'm running out of time, but let me just conclude nevertheless. The murder of Jedwabne Jews leaves a historian of modern Poland perplexed and groping for explanation. Nothing of the sort has been recorded or written about in scholarly literature. In a desperate effort to somehow domesticate these events, images from long-gone past flood memory, giving the semblance, by virtue of familiarity, of making sense of what we have learned. Perhaps the mass murders in Radziów and Jedwabne were an anachronism belonging to an entirely different epoch. One cannot shake the impression that by some fiat, peasant mobs stepped off the pages of Henryk Sienkiewicz's national saga of 17th century wars, trilogy, onto the soil of Białystok Voivodeship in the summer of 1941. Ever since Chmielnicki's peasant wars, which in Jewish mythologized memory are encoded by the terrifying word Churban, catastrophe, a foreshadowing of the Shoah, Jews suffered the destructive force inimical to everything different which lay in wait in the countryside of those lands, bursting into the open occasionally in paroxysm of violence. Evidently, slaughter and plunder remained in the standing repertory of collective behavior in these parts and was played out every so often during the 19th and 20th century. Where did this explosive potential come from? We must remember that in the background of anti-Jewish violence, there always lurked a suspicion of ritual murder, a conviction that Jews used for the preparation of Passover matzah, the fresh blood of innocent Christian children. It was a deeply ingrained belief among many Polish Catholics, and not simply among residents of the boondocks only. After all, rumors that Jews were engaged in these practices drew incensed crowds into the streets of Polish cities at a moment's notice after the Second World War as well. The Shoah has been portrayed in scholarly literature as a phenomenon rooted in modernity. We know very well that in order to kill millions of people, an efficient bureaucracy is necessary and a relatively advanced technology. But the murder of Jedwabne Jews reveals yet another, deeper, more archaic layer of this enterprise. I am not only referring to the motivations of the murderers. After all, Jedwabne residents and peasants from Łomża County could not yet have managed to soak up the vicious anti-Jewish Nazi propaganda, even if they had been willing and ready, but also to primitive ancient methods and murder weapons: stones, wooden clubs, iron bars, fire and water, as well as the absence of organization. It is clear from what happened in Jedwabne that we must approach the Holocaust as a heterogeneous phenomenon. On the one hand, we have to be able to account for it as a system which functioned according to a preconceived, though constantly evolving plan. But simultaneously, we must also be able to see it as a mosaic composed of discrete episodes, improvised by local decision makers, and hinging on unforced behavior, rooted in God knows what motivations of all those who were near the murder scene at the time. This makes all the difference in terms of assessing responsibility for the killings, as well as calculating the odds for survival that confronted the Jews, of course. I shall proceed and conclude what I have here. Well, let me say in conclusion a few words, and also to some extent about Jedwabne. I want to say, and this may be a little bit suspended in the air, but the fact that I can't really go into details of various other aspects of it, but this was a story that has not been told, of course, for a very long time. A history of a society can be conceived as a collective biography. And just like in a biography, which is also composed of discrete episodes, everything in the history of a society is in rapport with everything else. And if at some point in the collective biography a big lie is situated, then everything that comes afterwards will be devoid of authenticity and laced with fear of discovery. And instead of living their own lives, members of such a community will be suspiciously turning around, trying to guess what others think about what they are doing. They will keep diverting attention from shameful episodes buried in the past and go on, in this case, defending Poland's good name no matter what. They will take all setbacks and difficulties to be a consequence of some deliberate enemy conspiracies. Poland is not an exception in this respect in Europe, and just like several other nations, in order to reclaim its own past, Poland will have to tell its past to itself anew. An appropriate memento is to be found where else in Jedwabne. Inscriptions were engraved there on 2 stone monuments commemorating the time of war. One of them simply propagates a lie by stating that Jedwabne Jews were killed by the Nazis. This is a monument that has been removed by now. The other, which was put up in post-1989 Poland, after the communist rule there collapsed, is more revealing. It reads, and I quote, "To the memory of about 180 people, including 2 priests, who were murdered on the territory of Jedwabne district in the years 1939-1956 by the NKVD, Soviet secret police, the Nazis, and the Polish secret police, UB." Unquote, and it is signed Society, Społeczeństwo. And thus, this is my commentary, it either suggests, this inscription, that there were no Jews in Jedwabne at all, or else offers an unwitting admission of the crime. For indeed, the 1,600 Jedwabne Jews were killed neither by the Soviet secret police and KVD, nor by the Nazis, nor by the Polish Stalinist secret police. Instead, as we know now beyond reasonable doubt, and as Jedwabne citizens knew all along, it was their neighbors who killed them. Thank you very much.
Professor Gross would very much like you to ask questions, especially relating to this very text, questions that would enlighten that what he was just, answers that would enlighten that what he was just talking about.
My name is Jack Earp. I was born around Poland, and I am a Holocaust survivor. The one thing I'm confused with, why did it take so long, 60 years to come out with this now? But they had the clergy, but they had the church come out with something like this. They've done the same thing what's happened after the war, after the survived concentration. A lot of our people went back that are broken kids. You recall that 68 people went back the night they arrived in Texas that were killed by the soul, not forgotten.
Yeah, well, this is a story. Of course, the history of Polish-Jewish relations during the war and after the war has not been told yet. And this is one of these episodes that has not been told. There is many more of that history that has not been told yet. There are many reasons for it. I mean, in part because it's such a shameful history, in part because for many, many years, until 10 years ago, one was not able to tell everything one wanted to tell in Poland. It was a period of communist rule, very heavy censorship, and communists were not interested in bringing out the story of Jewish martyrdom on Polish soil. Those of you who at some point had the chance, for example, to visit Auschwitz and just see the way this museum has been constructed and displayed, you wouldn't find until a few years ago the word Jew. You would know that Jews have been killed there. You would know that there are victims of fascism from all countries of Europe. But and this is the way in which the display has been organized under the auspices of the communist regime in Poland. So, in part, one must say that the time in which the historiography of this period can really fully address the horror of these times is relatively short. As far as Jedwabne goes, let me also say that, quite interestingly, even though the story has been written up by survivors of Jewish survivors of Jedwabne in their memorial book, and which has been published 20 years ago in 1980, it was not really picked up by Jewish historians either, whether in this country or in Israel. It's Israel Gutman, who is a good friend, and has spoken about this whole episode publicly, and who, as you know, is a very well-known historian associated and writing on this period. He's been kind of a director of research and now is emeritus, but still advising Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. He gave an interview on this to a Polish newspaper saying, in a way, the book passed through my hands. In some ways, I have read this, but I did not register what has happened. This is new to me. So I would say there are so many reasons why the whole story has not been told. One of which is that it is so horrific that it simply defies imagination. People, I count myself among those, read a testimony of the fate of Jewish, of some Jews in some locality, and it really takes years to come to terms with it and for the veracity and reality of this account to sink into one's mind. So it was with Jedwabne. It's just the notion that such a horrendous and total and brutal and quick a murder could take place just did not fit very well into what we knew about this period.
I want to more. During the Jaruzelski era, during Kami's era, I wasn't Poland, I was in Auschwitz. During that time, there was a group of people from Long England. The lecturer was a Polish professor, a woman. A woman from and according to that professor, all of that fascists they committed during that time in Germany.
I intend to do this tomorrow in greater detail. But let me just say in a few words. First of all, this is a phenomenon. The episode, the Jedwabne murder, became. It's not just let's forget about my book for a moment. You know, the book. Because there are two issues here. First, the story of Jedwabne and the way it has been presented by me. The story of Jedwabne has now been taken into cognizance by, in fact, the entire society. In recent public opinion polls, they have done 2 public opinion polls on the Jedwabne issue and various questions related to it, whether Poles should ask forgiveness of Jews, and asking all series of questions. In the last poll in September, 92% of it was a national sample of people polled have heard about Jedwabne. Jedwabne is identified. This is more than, I'm sure, the percentage of those who know who is Polish president, with the exception of knowing who is the Pope. I'm sure this is the most. So it's a phenomenon that is on the agenda. People know about it, and they have opinion. Opinions vary, starting from those who would deny that there was any Polish participation in it, and ending up with those who accept the narrative and who take action as a result of it. And this is by all measures, a much more important group. The elite is fully aware of it. The main politicians in Poland, like the president of Poland, have taken an absolutely honest and incredibly open-minded stand on this. They speak on it every time they are interviewed. They just respond with full sense of, in his case, just taking responsibility for it, for which he was blamed by a lot of Polish media. You know, that's how can you take responsibility in the name of the Poles for it? I mean, so there was this ceremony on the 60th anniversary in Jedwabne, in which a new monument has been erected, to which the president came, made a wonderful and very moving speech. It was broadcast on television. So this is as far the story of Jedwabne goes. You know, it's just. The book itself, there is a controversy over the book, and I'll speak about it gladly when we meet. By the way, nothing as far as its scholarship and findings are concerned has been, in my judgment, challenged successfully. But again, I'll tell about criticisms and what they mean later on. What I want to say only is this: there is a very important literary prize that's offered in Poland it was 5th year in a row, the Nike Literary Prize. Czesław Miłosz, among others, who is, as you know, the Nobel Prize winner in literature. He's a Polish poet but living in America. Received Nike 2 years ago. Another great Polish poet a year ago, by the name of Różewicz, and there were 2 very important writers previously. This book was a finalist this year. I didn't receive the prize, somebody else did. I received, however, the prize of readers, the kind of a popular, this is a prize that's sponsored, among other things, by the main newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, and then before the announcement of the prize, they polled the readers. And ex aequo, I received this reader's prize with the person who later on would receive the real prize. But that gives you a sense of how the intellectual elite views it. You know, to put it up as a candidate for this award is a great nobilization of this piece. And so, in other words, there is very vociferous criticism, and there is very vociferous and loud praise. Loot them. Yes, yes.
One of the possessions. That's kind of surprising because of the violence committed in history and as
You know, let me say simply that such killings have not been done in other places, essentially. Don't misunderstand me. During the Holocaust period, during this horrible time, a lot of Jews in a lot of places have been killed by their neighbors, obviously. But the Jedwabne case is very special in that it's the entire Jewish population of a village, very unlike what other killings would be. Essentially, in the context of absence of German forces, is killed by their neighbors, the entire population. This simply was not happening. We don't have stories like this written up now 60 years after the events. An awful lot of literature on Holocaust is in your library and in many other libraries. Such episodes were very rare. I mean, rare to the point of being unique. There are these 3 villages here. We'll find out about small places in Lithuania in the future, etc. There will be other cases. But they are, you know, there were over 3 million Jews who lived in this territory. If you take Russian Jews, it would be easily, who were taken in under German occupation, 4 million Jews. So there were many opportunities to, if there was nothing surprising in it, as you suggest, you know, given the attitudes the local population will have, why not kill them? Why do you need a reason to plunder, for instance? Clearly, human beings need a reason somehow, and there needs to be a kind of an environment in which these horrors can be done before they kill other people. And the circumstances have been created by the Nazis in this territory. This degree of ferocity and brutality would not have taken place but for the fact of the German occupation. It's just, I am deeply convinced of it, both in Jedwabne and in other places. So, you know, irrespective of tremendous volume and intensity of prejudice and hatred and long centuries of anti-Semitism, the murderous quality of it, this kind of murderous quality, is a very special, very unique, and very, fortunately, it's an event that puzzles us. I mean, that's in part why there was such a response to this book. I'm puzzled, I must say, until this very day.
What would you say about anti-Semitism in
Poland today? Unfortunately, it's there, and it became it came into the surface in a much more kind of a pronounced way than in other words, this is one of the prices that have been paid for freedom of speech. From 1989, essentially, this is a free country as far as politics is concerned, and one of the kind of elements in public opinion which became visible in public space is anti-Semitism. It's connected to there are church milieus that have been involved. In any case, well, there is a certain milieu actually, and some personalities who make public statements that are unacceptable and anti-Semitic in a variety of ways. But this is just, and unfortunately, I must say, this time, in this month, actually last month, in September, for the first time in 10 years of freedom, During that time, there were several elections in Poland that took place, national and local elections, and always the parties and political movements that had these vociferous anti-Semites among their prominent members and leaders would miserably fail. They never made it into the parliament. This time, there are two parties that, even though this was not part of the political rhetoric in the elections, but there are several individuals there who are just openly anti-Semitic and proud to be so, have entered the parliament. So there is now about 18% of the electorate that voted in such politicians. Well, I might say that this is not by European standards of the day. If you think about Le Pen in France, or Haider in Austria, or Torjan in I think this is his name in Hungary. This is not a unique phenomenon. You know, it's there. It's just there is a kind of a populist, nationalist, xenophobic backlash that one finds all over there, and also I want to say in every society that goes through a very fast-paced and complicated process of transition. What's going on in Poland from the point of view of social and economic transformation is a very rapid and dramatic shift from one way of doing business to another, and a lot of people fall out and cannot cope, so have to find a reason and scapegoats to explain their failure, and it's in periods like this of fast social change, xenophobia is on the rise.
Let me see many hands up. Perhaps you would be so kind and ask these questions from Professor Gross when we are outside in the reception. I think it is 7 o'clock, and I think we must leave this place right now, because there will be at 8 o'clock a concert, and in a way we have now to leave. But please ask him the questions, and sure he will answer.